Well, thanks for coming today, everybody. Because we're starting a little bit later, and also just kind of the nature of how this shaped up, and with what I alluded to about the having to communicate with the state of Michigan and the police earlier today. Um, it's a little bit more conversational in a like these are ideas that are still being developed, even though my ideas are more developed than might be made to seem from some of the slides, because I didn't have as much time to go back and polish. So forgive my lack of polish in some of the places where it might be um, a little bit bumpy. But I'm kind of doing that on purpose, and I feel like this is a good space to do it anyway because I'm working on creating a paper based on these ideas. And actually, I've been thinking about these ideas since this was originally going to be one of my dissertation chapters, but it kind of just didn't pan out in that I had too many things to say and had a hard time figuring out how to turn it into one chapter. Um, so I say conversation because there are a few interactive components. We'll see how that goes. But mostly I'm curious what people think and what kind of questions come up and how this lands with other folks, so that I can get a sense of where I might take the paper and what things I might want to expand on and which things are like, oh, that's obvious. I don't have to say too much about it. So feel free to stop me if you have any questions. This talk is I could go in depth on pretty much any one of these things, but this talk is kind of like trying to lay out the ideas. So if there's anything you want me to dig into, feel free at any moment, and I'll happily expand on it now or at the end. Okay. Anyway, that without further ado, let's jump in. So the emphasis of my talk is on moving from the idea of theory as just a tool that we use in a utilitarian sense to theory as a way of living, a way of life, via the aesthetic take on theorizing in mathematics education research. I'll unpack a lot of those things, but ultimately, my goal is to move so that we view theory in a more personal, dynamic, idiosyncratic way, as opposed to just this arcane kind of thing that we use just in our research. So I'm going to start with this fake journal of a doctoral student entry that my colleagues Aida Alabek, James Dramala, and I wrote in one of our papers to encapsulate a bunch of different graduate students' experiences with theorizing. So this is just a snippet, but I'm going to read it out loud. I survived my first semester, though I feel like I have more questions than answers compared to when I started. It's hard not to feel incompetent sometimes. I'm not entirely sure what a theoretical framework is, let alone how to choose one for my research. Does it depend on the research question, the topic of study, the methods used? Maybe it's based on my personal epistemology, whatever that is. People keep telling me I'll figure it out, but I feel so lost, especially when trying to dig deeper into the differences between theories. I keep stumbling into larger epistemological and ethical questions. One of my professors told me we're not philosophers, we're mathematics education researchers, so we don't need to get too hung up on the philosophical details. Am I overthinking it? I have no idea, and I feel lost. And this was fictional, but it's a compilation. We used a narrative inquiry kind of approach. So it's a compilation of stories that we heard from colleagues and friends and folks we mentored as well as ourselves. So some of these things actually happened, and some of like that quote from a professor is something I know multiple people have been told. So that leads us into a bit of a conversation starter. Maybe we will cut out more time, the full 5 minutes to do this, just because of where we're at on time. But I do want you to reflect on these questions and what theory means to you right now. What questions do you have about theory? So here's a few questions. I'm going to give you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to think about it, and then we'll share out. The first is, what is theory or a theoretical framework to you? The second is, what is your relationship with theory at present? And the third is, what are you grappling with lately when it comes to theory? We don't have tons of time, so feel free to dig into the one that grips you and reflect via writing, draw something, do whatever makes sense, and then we'll come back and share out a little bit how we're thinking about these things. I know it hasn't been much time, but take the next 30 seconds to wrap up and then we'll share out. Alrighty. You don't need to share comprehensively every single thing you thought or said, but I would like to hear at least three share outs. It could be about any one of these questions, just to get a sense of how people are thinking about this. Because first of all, I'm not expecting people to think about theory in the same way that's built into all of the things I'm saying throughout this talk. Does anybody want to get started by sharing something that they were thinking about?
I guess maybe I'll start because in my dissertation I used two kind of theoretical frameworks. And so I think I just have a very kind of utilitarian sense of what it is. I don't think that it's something to be taken like too seriously ultimately because it's just maybe I'm a bit cynical because it's just like the important thing is publication, and so you need to adhere to the norms of the field, right? And it does kind of frustrate me because there are some ways in which I think the theory could be used better, but it's like that could compromise just my ability to, get it published or whatever.
I think your frustrations are not abnormal. And I like your point about the role that theory plays in getting things published and the norms and expectations of our field, because that, of course, is a big underlying factor here. Anybody want to share their thoughts or add on something, Matt? Go ahead,
Tim,
Tim.
just go.
Okay. I have an even more cynical view, of course. Mine's is like I have a very adversarial relationship a lot of the time with theoretical frameworks, since my research is a project that is not uniformly united by a singular existing theory, which leads me to pick and choose different ones depending on the specific sub research question I'm on, which feels kind of awful and I know leads to having issues getting published. Um, because it doesn't have that nice sweeping singular theoretical framework that all of my different research questions fall under. But when you're looking at socioeconomic questions, there can be very different theories and very different structures depending on what type of disparity we're actually talking about and who we're talking about.
Yeah, I like those points. Again, the feelings around feeling adversarial when it comes to theory, but also I'm picking up on your point around, in your experience, the field values this kind of unified sense of theory where there's a simplicity to it, even though you're trying to apply theories differently in different questions. So that's another thing
Yes.
to pick up on. And then Johan is writing insights. I'll share them out. Johan says theoretical framework to me is A, the glue that binds the research parts together. Research question, methods, results, discussion. It used to also confuse me a lot when I thought about deciding which framework to use. What really helped me was thinking about how the theoretical framework is similar to musical signature. There are multiple good signatures, and you just have to pick one that makes everything sound harmonious. Well, I'm all for that, given the nature of this conversation about aesthetics and theorizing. Um, I highlight OA glue as opposed to the glue because I'm working on a sister paper right now with my advisor, and it's a different framework from her original work, and now suddenly it's singing a different harmony. Ooh, I love that expectancy and value theory and now cultural historical activity theory. I love the way that you are thinking with your own metaphors here and bringing in the artistic bend. Because I think this gets at, again, like we all talked about theories differently. This is getting at, I think, both a combination of the utilitarian and what it's for, but also how it feels, how it sounds to us, and how there are many different ways that theory could sound or feel or be. And that's going to be something that I will definitely be hitting on. We could keep going, and I would if we had more time, but I want to make sure that I get to at least the main point so that we can talk about it at the end. But I love this. And I think that some of the things that got brought up around struggling with theory, some of the things that I'm about to talk about will hopefully resonate with y'all. So, those are some of the things we thought about theory. Here's some quotes that I pulled about theory, some that I like, some that are famous. Bell Hooks famously said in Teaching to Transgress, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location of healing. So that's one perspective. Here's another from Mathad. We want to encourage researchers to take up their theory in more creative ways, to grapple with the way theory lives through us. Theories live through us in our actions and desires. Theory pursues its own force along creative lines of flight as well as lines of containment. And then another Mathad take from Jablonka and colleagues. A sometimes observed hostility towards theory in mathematics education research is based on a misreading of theory as mere contemplation and speculation. Theorizing includes systematization of and critical reflection upon practice that opens up new ideas. Seen in this way, theorizing is indispensable for the advancement of the field. So these are three different takes. I'm emphasizing them because, in some ways, they stand in contrast to the stereotypes that we see in the field. Because if we take a look at the status quo, and I don't go into tons of details in about this in the talk, but I read any paper in a major journal or conference proceedings in our field that I could find over the last like 20 or 30 years that is like a general conversation about theory or theorizing or theoretical frameworks because I was interested in the messages that we're sending about theory to emerging scholars in particular. Because also, I think these are the kind of things that contain the messages the field has in general, but also what we're telling people about theory who are getting started is going to become what the field sees as theory, right? So this is informed by a lot more than I'm able to cite here, and I don't want to deal with all the details, and I don't claim that this is systematic or anything, but I read so many papers to reach a lot of these conclusions. And one of the takeaways, well, this isn't really a takeaway, this is a common definition that's thrown around that I think most folks have probably seen something like at one point. A theoretical framework encompasses the set of assumptions, theories, hypotheses, and claims, as well as the relationships between them that guide a researcher's thinking about the phenomenon being studied. And I'm not being doctrinaire about the definition here, but that's giving a rough sense of what I'm thinking about and what the field's thinking about when we use this word. There is recognition that theorizing is a dynamic process underpinned by philosophical assumptions, and Bickner-Ansbach et al. Talk about networking theories quite a bit. But David Stinson cautions that most existing math ed research offers only limited acknowledgement of these philosophical underpinnings. And this is a key aspect of how I'm thinking of theory and how Stinson thinks about theory. He writes, in the end, considerations of ontology, epistemology, ethics, values, subjective and ideological grounds, and so on, that as a researcher's worldview should precede, not follow, theoretical and philosophical considerations. Sorry, it's under my bar. Methodological conversations, darn. So, despite the fact that there is acknowledgement that these philosophical pieces, values, ideologies, things matter, there isn't as much conversation about how those factor into theorizing specifically for emerging scholars. I'm just going to keep going. We'll dig into that later if needed. Also, across the literature, here's some guidance that is pretty common, and I cited a few examples that are commonly cited, but look in most literature and you'll see some of these things recur. Uh, what are theoretical frameworks supposed to do? They're supposed to make the case for the purpose of a study, shape the lit review, justify the study designs and methods, focus and guide the reporting, interpretation, and discussion of the results, and their implications, go beyond description to provide insight into causes, meanings, and connections, give us understanding, help narrow the scope of research, focus on particular things, starting analysis, codes, ways of organizing data, hinting at relationships. And a common one that Johan kind of alluded to this with the idea of glue. A really common point is that theory provides coherence across the parts of a study. However, it's almost never clarified exactly what that means. That's just left up to the researchers, as Tim, you pointed out, being a difficulty and a frustration. But what I noticed across this is almost all of these are about how theory is a tool to do something or communicate something to somebody else, like the field. Um, Oftentimes it's abstract and separate from the individual. The idea is that theory has to communicate with somebody else. It has to be generalized, things like that. And like I said, primarily for the sake of the field. And I want to just point out how much of a departure this is for some of the quotes that I had just read about theorizing earlier from across math ed research and beyond, where theory was deeply personal, something to be lived, it's dynamic, it's moving. Whereas a lot of most of the guidance that you see in math ed in a lot of these papers that I reviewed is very utilitarian and cold and abstract, doesn't tell you what it means to use these ideas in your life. It's just like, here's a theory, pick it off of a shelf. Um, And this is the main conclusion that I reached essentially is that the math ed literature on theory and theoretical framework specifies the utilitarian roles that they should play when they're already crafted, but there's very little guidance on how somebody might actually create a theory or theoretical framework that satisfies those roles. And there's very, very little on how you might do this in a way that the theories you're using, the theoretical frameworks you create and you put together align with somebody's values or their worldview. So it's not surprising that emerging scholars regularly experience tensions and frustrations. I've spoken before in a PMANA report from a few years back. Let me know if you're interested and I'll share it. Um, but basically, it's common, I think, for emerging scholars to face a sense of tension between the theories that they're using and their worldviews because there's a lot of unpacked or not unpacked implicit pieces and philosophical assumptions and values baked into the theories that are common in our field and basically any theory about what it means to be human, what it means to learn, etc. And there isn't tons of attention to how to do that unpacking and thinking about what's a good theory for me and what I want for myself and how I want to view the world. I mean, some of that's there, but I speculated that this is a main tension that can't always be articulated by emerging scholars, especially when we're not really creating space to have these kinds of reflections. But it's what leads to this, what I call the just doesn't feel right dilemma for crafting theoretical frameworks. What I like to think about is instead of having this opposite tug where there's the tension between one's worldviews and values and the philosophies baked into the frameworks they're using, is to think about what if we could have these forces working with each other so there was alignment between these two, and then we could tie a tight theoretical knot. But then the question is, how do we tie the knot? Because, like I said, there's not tons of guidance in the literature on how to do this, specifically for people who are completely new to this, let alone for established researchers. This is just something that emerging scholars struggle with. It's a regular struggle for everybody. Um, the reason I care about this is I would love to go into the your work is over theorized feedback. And some of you are probably remembering where this might have come from a room conference feedback from one of our colleagues. But it's common for scholars to comment on how people theorize and the ways they theorize. And when you theorize in ways that are different from what is the norm within a sub area of math ed or room, it's pretty common for people to call that out and not even recognize that it's an assumption that is a choice because we're so immersed in it. It's like the water we live in. But there's a lot of harm when we tell people how to theorize because theories are how we think about the world, right? And our perspectives and values are baked into that. And when we say you have to theorize like this, it's not always that obvious, but when we do that, it's gatekeeping. It results in same research, and it's hard for emerging scholars to even know how do I do that initial communication to do what I want to do. So that's how I came to this originally, both in my own struggle in the emerging scholars I was working with, this is actually how I got more interested in graduate education, was thinking about these questions for math education graduate students. As Belcher puts it, you can't decide not to do theory because everything is theoretical. Everything you write is influenced by some theory, whether you know it or not. You use theory deliberately or it uses you. And I just took a class with Elizabeth St. Pierre, and across all her work, she constantly reiterates that you have been theorized as a person. If you want to change the way that humans are viewed, learning is viewed to align more with how you're thinking about it, you got to do that work. You might be somebody who accepts it too, and great. But if you're somebody who wants to do that, you got to do the work. And I'm interested in how do we create space for that work to happen? Because without some kind of guidance and openness to these new things, we increase the chance that emerging scholars will just feel pressure to imitate what has come before and already exists. Lauren Balcom has a great provocation from PMENA in 2019, where she asked the question, how can we carve a new path, one of wholeness for all scholars in our community of math ed research? And that's a question that I'm guided by and why I care about this topic too. I see this questioning as a way to push back on a culture of exclusion in math ed and specifically gatekeeping in doctoral education. Because doc students and emerging scholars come in with values and worldviews and convictions and things, and often we, based on our doctoral curriculum, assume to varying degrees that they have to learn this new view of theory. They have to learn how the field does it as if they haven't been teachers. They haven't been people for years and years and years where they've theorized the world in their own ways. Um, the way when we view theory as detached and cold and generalized, it doesn't value those kinds of theory. And that's the kind of thing that can lead to these tensions that are problematic and leads to bad work and repeating the same things over and over again, in my opinion. I'm framing this aesthetically, and I'm thinking with, I don't dig into this too much, but I am thinking with Jacques Rancière's ideas around this. He is a philosopher of equality who talks a lot about aesthetics and how aesthetics, politics, and ethics are intertwined. And like I hinted towards, I'm viewing theorizing as an aesthetic thing. It's a choice. It's not like we have to do it like this. It's a community decided, it's a norm, it's a value, it's aesthetic in the end, right? They're just things that have become solidified over time within certain communities. So Jacques Rancière talks about how the privileged aesthetics of a given sociocultural community, so that could be the math ed community at large, it could be the room community, there's a bunch of sub communities, and they all theorize in slightly different ways. Um, but the chosen aesthetics, the privileged aesthetics, the status quo of theorizing, results in a distribution of what is seen as sensible and normal. And therefore, aesthetics are determining who and what makes sense and has common sense. The people who are doing things differently are seen as like, what are you doing? That doesn't make sense. And that's how he sees and I see the connection between aesthetics and ethics. These are not just like, I think this theory's pretty. It's like, no, I view the world like this, so I analyze my data like this. And if you get a reviewer that says, no, that's over theorized, you are being pushed out of trying to say the things that you want to say and observe and critique. So I use aesthetics, and some people see aesthetics as peripheral or just beauty, but I see it as something deeper that's intertwined with ethics and the socio-political factors here. I'm gonna have to decide what to speed up on, but I think I like these quotes. And this is kind of, I'm the kind of person who tends to have really big introductions. So sorry if you're not somebody who loves that, but the quotes have really helped ground me in why I care about this. And I hope at the very least sharing cool quotes from scholars from across math and other spaces is helping you think in different ways from what we often see in the literature. Because I had to go fishing for a lot of these, honestly. Finding even any quotes that are aligned somewhat with how I think about these things with relation to theorizing is kind of hard to find in the math ed literature on these topics. But Stephen Lerman in our field did a lit review of, I think it was ESM publications or something like that. But one of the conclusions that he and his team made, they looked at the theories that people were using at the time. And he said, regarding the reason for the adoption of new theories rather than pursuing existing ones, we might suggest that there's a connection here with researchers creating identities, making a unique space from which to speak in novel ways. So the way we theorize is linked to our identities, who we are as people. Nis, also in our field, critiquing some of the ways that journal editors were writing about theorizing in 2019. Um, Concludes that the most important thing is that we work to keep the waters open while remaining and becoming open-minded, reflective, prepared and able to discuss the nature of our field. And then James Dramala, and in the paper that James Aida and I wrote, we talk about theorizing as a form of self-love, doing this necessary reflection so that you can do the work that you really want to do, that you desire to do, that aligns with your history, the histories of the people you're trying to support and understand and work with, your communities. And then I just really like this quote by arts-based researcher Tom Barone. He's reflecting on after his dissertation defense and talking with his advisor. He was doing arts-based research like 30 or 40 years ago, and it was still controversial. So he says, moreover, fighting the good fight can be exhilarating as well as challenging. Indeed, at the party following the defense, I feel simultaneously elated and fatigued. Phew, it's exhausting when you swim upstream, I said. And then his advisor says, it's how you know you are alive, which I just love. So I've been building this up a lot, as I tend to do. So what's my contribution to all this besides synthesizing all these cool quotes and big things together? Well, my contention is, and I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but the way that I've started to think about this and create conversations around theorizing that I think moves us in a direction towards emphasizing the personal and challenging the strictly cold utilitarian view of theory, is that we can shift to viewing theorizing as a fundamentally artistic and aesthetic practice. Because when you think about art and aesthetics, it's obvious that the person doing it, is entangled in that work, right? Humanities oriented people don't question this at all. Whereas in the sciences and math, we view theory as cold and separate, right? So my answer is let's move to a different space and metaphor and emphasize those things, and suddenly a new kind of possibility can unlock. Um, this is not something that is completely unmentioned in the math ed literature, although I noticed that it's very rarely emphasized. Folks would mention something here and there about it, but they wouldn't dig into it at all or explain what they meant. This is again like I was finding the little tiny pieces and gluing them together because of my perspective on this. Lester and Cobb talk about how we should be bricoleurs, craft people who design theoretical frameworks by purposely gluing together separate, disparate pieces. And Jim Fakai and the JRME editors at the time, in one of their editorials, talked about how the choice or construction of a theoretical framework is something of an art. They don't dig into what that means at all. But another thing that I noticed is some of the metaphors around theorizing really emphasize frames. So Denise Mewborn, now Spangler's PME&A talk on this in 2005, that's been cited quite a bit in our field, talks about the metaphor of theory as a picture frame, as a bed frame, as frames of animation. She says the material from which the frame is made, the size of the frame, and the placement of the frame in relation to the image all influence how an observer processes the image. And she didn't dig into this factor at all, but I can't help but notice that these are all aesthetic considerations. You're not just going to pick any old frame. You're going to pick the one that looks pretty to put on your wall that you think frames the picture nicely. When it comes to a bed, like look at all these possibilities. You're not just going to pick any old bed frame for your theoretical frame, right? You're going to pick the one that feels comfortable, the one that is soft or has the vibes that you're looking for. And frames of animation is literally an art form. So I couldn't help but noticing, like, this is an untapped dimension that we always have there. People talk about it, but it hasn't been fully dug into in a way that I think could be valuable. And that's the contribution that I'm trying to speak to here. I'm going to do this really quickly. Happy to talk with anybody more about this, but this is kind of my theoretical framework and how I think about aesthetics section. And of course, I could go on for hours about this because I like aesthetics. But I think the most important things to know is, like I was saying before, I don't just view aesthetics as equal to beauty. That's often how it's thought of in math education, even if you look at Paul Ernest's work on, like, one of the major philosophers of math ed, synthesizing results from the whole field. Um, so when I think of aesthetics, I'm including positive and negative things too. So messy, impure, ugly, joy, wonderment, curiosity. Clearly, there's an intersect between affect and emotion with aesthetics too. I don't see those as separable personally. And this goes back to the original etymology of aesthetics. It's knowledge acquired through sensory perception, a peculiar way of knowing that permeates all experience through bodily engagement with the world. Essentially, aesthetics was thought of as an epistemological thing, a way of knowing that's intersected with the senses. Learning and aesthetics, therefore, cannot be disentangled. And this is where I'm going to skip a bunch of things. Um, there's a ton of research. Well, there's not a ton. It's actually an emerging field. There's a lot of research on how this matters in the context of learning mathematics for students. That's emerging. Um, like selecting the research questions that we care about, certain aesthetic reactions that can motivate what direction you might want to pursue in your own research or students' research inquiry, etc. This idea that our personal aesthetics influence our everyday practices, the things we're doing every moment. Like, how have I organized my desk? Well, yeah, it's a utilitarian thing. I need the pens to be where they are so I can grab them quickly. But I also organize it in a way so it's comfortable and balanced. And like when I get here, I like being here, right? It's both of these things. Our aesthetics are influencing some of these things that we might not think about immediately. Like, how do you set the dinner table, too? Like, that's partially aesthetic. This is something that in the humanities they talk about, like it's commonplace. In indigenous philosophies, aesthetics are emphasized a lot more. And what I'm drawing in is a philosophy of everyday aesthetics, which started from one of Dewey's classic works from the 1930s and has been taken up and intersected more with Western views of aesthetics now. Japanese, Chinese, etc., that get at more of these like aesthetics as something that's lived and that like the yin yang, the like everyday things can be aesthetic. Okay, so I am going to. So there is stuff said about aesthetics and theorizing, especially outside of our field, even in science. A lot of philosophy of science folks advocate for how these decisions are not purely logical. There's aesthetics of like what is seen as simple, what is seen as beautiful, what is seen as symmetric, what does it mean for something to be simple in the first place? And those conversations are not as common in math ed research, but it has been a trend over the past 5 to 10-ish years for these conversations in math ed to start emphasizing the value dimension, the axiological aspect in theorizing. What's interesting though is aesthetics is very rarely the part that's emphasized. It's more the value side. So this brings me to, with my very limited time, we'll see where I get. I might just throw it out there and then we'll see what kind of questions and conversation comes up with whoever's able to stick around. This brings me to an alternative metaphor building on these ideas that I think is powerful. Um, I argue that theorizing could be thought of as crafting theoretical spaces of our own to live in. So theorizing is architectural or interior design, or both at the same time. One of my inspirations is from Grant and Asanlu. I think they're from like administrative education or something like that. Not in math, that is the key. But they talk about how crafting a theoretical framework is like being an architect, creating a blueprint for a house. I really liked that. And then as I was working on interior design of my apartment, came to realize like, wait, crafting a theoretical framework is like crafting a mood board for interior design. And I kind of combine these things together and see them as getting at this major point of theorizing is crafting a space to live in that is both pretty but also functional. So the emphasis here is on how aesthetics influence this, but also there are utilitarian things too. When you build a house, you want a bathroom and a kitchen. But there are also different aesthetic choices that are made that are personal. What kind of architectural styles do you like? What kind of layouts do you like? Open concept, etc. And this becomes the space we live in. How would you like to build and decorate your theoretical house? Which theoretical neighborhoods do you want to construct or live within? Who do you want to talk with? What kind of houses do you want to see down the road? How do you want your space to feel? What functions do you want it to serve? And then interior design gets at a same kind of idea, specifically with mood boarding, where the idea of a mood board is putting a bunch of the inspirations together to get at how they cohere, right? So that's the main goal of this is establishing coherence, making things fit together, trying them out, taking things off, moving things on, which I think resonates really nicely with how theory ultimately is said to do that. But I also feel like this mood boarding ideal gives kind of a practical way of thinking about that process of establishing coherence that is less like a reviewer will look at it and say if it's coherent or not. Um, again, the emphasis that I want to point out is that this emphasizes both. in both of these metaphors, but in the case of a mood board, the utilitarian and the aesthetic, the form and the function are not separate. They go hand in hand. You don't want to design a room that you hate to use or be in. Like literally one of the first things a lot of people will say is don't design a place that's just aesthetic that you're going to hate. Um, a mood board design iteratively, like I was saying, so making gradual changes to your space or project. It's not just like you have to pick off a framework from the shelf based on what somebody else did. It allows for mixing and matching very explicitly. And it allows you to craft and find your style and try things out. Try this little bit of theory to code something. See if you can combine it with that, right? I did this at one point, and in my PMA&A paper, I talk about that more. I won't dig into it a ton because I'm already tight on time, but um, here are some of the main conclusions. This is the last piece. And then I'll wrap up and hear what people are thinking about and questions that y'all have. But here are six things that I think are useful about this framing that change the way that we could think about theoretical frameworks, both for emerging scholars trying to do these things and craft theoretical frameworks, but also just for our field and thinking about what are some alternative possibilities. So one, the emphasis is on the personal dimension from the get-go, making a space of one's own that is both aesthetically appealing and comfortable. Worldview then becomes a starting point. It's obvious that when you're designing a room in your house, you're not going to make something that you hate or is counter to your values and aesthetics. It's obvious that you start there. Utilitarian considerations become inseparable from the personal ones. Form and function matter equally. So I'm not saying tools are bad, right? These should be serving certain purposes, but that should go hand in hand with these other things. It shouldn't be one over the other entirely. This also emphasizes the sociocultural and situated nature of theory. There's no single way to theorize because there are multiple aesthetics of theorizing, just how there's multiple ways to design a house and multiple architectural styles and aesthetics. Like, do you like boho rooms? Do you like modern minimalism, right? And that gets at the point that within different cultures and areas of math ed and sub areas of research in general, there's different cultures and aesthetics of theorizing. So embracing this perspective makes it obvious that that's the case, as opposed to something somebody has to figure out or find their people. Coherence can mean many things in this context. What does it mean for a room to hang together for you on your mood board or how you bring together the blueprint of your house? It's no longer just about logic and internal consistency like coherence so often is in math and science contexts. Like I was saying before, theorizing involves eclectic mix and match of theoretical inspirations versus just having to pick something off the shelf. Um, it's not just to grab something somebody else did, it's make it your own. And this process is also iterative. It's not expected to happen at once, which I think could make this more user friendly for beginners, as a way of thinking of this metaphorically. And then finally, when theory and living in your space are seen as inseparable, it becomes clear that theory and practice are too, right? Theory is a way of thinking about how you're living and being, and therefore it is not the opposite of practice. They go hand in hand like form and function. So, my message is to go forth and craft your own theoretical spaces to live with and in. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brady. So, is there like a conversation component, or are we opening up for questions, or
Yeah, opening it up for comments, questions, any thoughts. It would have been more conversational if I would have had a little bit more time, but it's okay. And if y'all have to leave, I know we're at 6, so feel free to drop out. I won't be offended. But if anybody wants to stick around, I'm happy to chat.
So you talk about building a framework, layering it over time and slowly improving it. And my first instinct with that is like, even if the place you started with is good, and even if the place you're going to end up with is good and solidly built, that in between can probably look a little fuzzy. And if you
Mhm.
go in your publication process and you're in that in between step, how do you begin to navigate that, especially in a field that is very utilitarian in terms of theoretical frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of the metaphor is I think we should start using this because I think it could hopefully, ideally, I can be optimistic at this point because I'm proposing a new idea, right? And I've seen that it works at least for some people. As for most things, if this doesn't resonate with people, I'm not saying like I'm forcing you to think about this from an aesthetic perspective. But for folks who are feeling constrained, I found that this perspective can help them move outside of that box. So I feel like this is one thing that might help do this and hopefully help change how we think about these things so that, like you were pointing out, Tim, sometimes there is a sense of a judgment about, oh, the room isn't complete, therefore you can't publish this or you can't submit contributor report to the room conference. Speaking of relevant things that just came out. um, I am very much pro share work in progress. I think that's really important, actually, because one reason we don't know how people engage with these things and it becomes so secretive is because we view you have to have this finished product. And if you move in the aesthetic artistic direction and a more humanities oriented way of thinking about this versus a more like stereotypical scientific logical one, it becomes clear that we need to share the in-betweens and the messiness, and we should be open to that. That's another aesthetic way of theorizing and doing research, actually. Um, and I think that having some of this language to critique the more utilitarian perspective can also give people citational ammo. That's kind of violent. I don't want to use the word ammo, I guess, but it gives people citational fodder that they can use to justify why they're doing those things. Because one of the challenges is finding citations that show like, no, I'm not just making this up. Other people are thinking about theory like this too. Um, so I'm trying to kind of get at both of those things, and I acknowledge it's really messy. Honestly, one thing that I'll say that I've learned is find your communities that theorize in ways similar to you, and that's easy. It's way harder said than it's too late. I'm losing all of anyway. It's easier said than done. But what I found more and more is like I felt like I needed to conform to certain spaces, and then gradually I realized like, oh, I'm just never going to fully make sense in this space. I'm never going to be fully happy. But I found these other spaces now, or these other areas of math ed, or even a little outside of math ed, where they're just like, oh yeah, I'm more radical than you are on this. So finding those other spaces has helped me, and then it's allowed me to come back into room spaces and get a sense of what can I contribute? What are the conversations that will be taken up? Like, yeah, I still want to push room people, but I've learned that pushing so far and expecting people to be like, yeah, is not always going to work. So this helps me think more carefully about who I'm talking to and what aesthetic assumptions they have, I guess. That's not a full answer, but hopefully that gets at some of those things. I see Johan says, immediate thoughts. I love how physical this metaphor of architecture and interior design is for theoretical frameworks compared to the musical one I had. It brings to mind embodied cognition for me. I don't know enough about it except maybe that it's also a physical way of thinking. I also love that, Johan, and that's one thing that drew me to this that I haven't fully tapped into, admittedly. I was able to make a mood board that was about my theorizing in my dissertation. And I looked back at it recently, and there are parts that I haven't leaned into, and there are parts that literally don't make any sense to me anymore. But I see some of the parts that were the seeds of now that are like how I theorize and think about theory and what made it into my dissertation. And being able to move around those pieces as a like work in progress artistic thing, the physicality not only of the board, but thinking of this as a space to be in, I think really helps me. And it's one thing that makes it feel a little bit more concrete. I'm not arguing that this isn't a philosophical metaphor for theory. It's kind of pie in the sky. But I would be curious, what would happen if we started by saying this is what theory is to beginners, and you make a mood board of the inspirations that you have for your project and think about how those come together or clash, and then gradually figure out the ways that your worldview might be made to be a part of your work and how you theorize.
Thanks for this, Brady. I guess like one thing that I'm still thinking about is like the metaphor of like the design, like it's really like neat, and I think it's like a great like representation. But like I think like one thing that I'm still thinking about is like then in practice, so you offer this metaphor for like how to theorize, but then if it's about like the design, if we were to like situate it back into the real world, like does when people are designing like the to design like anything, like there's like accrued experience, like you learn how to design, right? And so like what does that look like? And there's like certain considerations about like design and architect and things like that, right? Like I can design a cool house, but if it's sort of like it looks cool in the way that I want it and it feels great, but it's like if it's in the middle of like Alaska in the winter, it's like it can look cool, but it sort of just like doesn't. I can have this really cool like open house thing, but like it just sort of doesn't fit
Yeah.
the thing that I want it to. But like me as a designer being like, oh, I think I did all the considerations. I wanted it to look cool. It feels like the kind of place that I want to like be in. I do that, but then like I don't know like where does sort of like that fit, and it makes me think about like all the different times that I've like theorized, and it was like not thankfully like more senior people have sort of like told me that it doesn't work, but it's sort of like how did those moments kind of like fit into this like meta like sort of like this idea of preparation and like how do I learn how to design, and like when those things like don't work, like sort of like how does that fit, right? Because like in art we sort of say like, oh, is there really ever a thing as like bad art, but like is there a thing as bad maybe it's a bad framework. Like I guess
Yeah.
like that's sort of like my like, and I want to share the anecdote of like I was gonna use counter storytelling for one of my papers, and Luis Leiva had to like tell me straight up that it doesn't work because I just sort of
Mm.
like I fell short in terms of like thinking about like the historical origins of like the theory, and it just doesn't apply, and it's like I thought it I came into that meeting and be like, this was a cool thing that I like thought about, and it's like, no, it just like doesn't work. And I was like, oh, like where do
Yeah.
those moments of like design that don't work? I guess I don't know, like if you've thought about like how does that those moments fit in that this metaphor, and like how preparation and sort of like there is like an element of like I need to learn how to design. I need to learn. There's certain
Yeah.
considerations that I have to like just
You're
attend
not just going to
to.
immediately jump in. There still is a, yeah, an
Right.
apprenticeship or a learning. And I think, well, first of all, I want to say I'm glad that this made you think those things because I haven't thought those exact things before. But I think it just bringing up all of those very visceral examples, like building a place in Alaska that doesn't make sense, gives us language that feels more concrete in a way of talking about these moments where it doesn't quite work for this, but then it's not just that you can't theorize like that, it's thinking about why doesn't that work? Why is Alaska not a good place to have a like beach house? And I think going back to the worldview piece and thinking about those philosophical undercurrents and worldviews and values, it gets more to that piece. And it gets more to the piece of what culture are you in? Maybe your culture of room or whatever, a subfield, is the Alaska metaphor. And you're trying to theorize in ways that are more humanities oriented. It is going to be harder to theorize in more humanities oriented ways in a space that is fundamentally more science oriented. Um, so I think it helps make us have those practical considerations and not just see it as an absolute. Because, like you were saying, and this is a huge debate, and I'm not necessarily weighing in on it necessarily, but this makes it clear that there's no like right way to theorize. A lot of theories just happen by chance. Like Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts. It's all about like what people vibed with. It's not always about perfect fit to all the evidence. It's what caught on, what big scholar pervade like shared these ideas in a way that like caught on at that moment that then now people are like so and so wrote so many things about this and it was cited so many times. I think that one of the things that makes it hard to see theory as something that you grow as a skill is because the way it's talked about in a lot of these publications that I reviewed across all of math ed is it's this thing that has to serve all these utilitarian roles for other people. And there's this sense of like it looks like something. And the person who gets to decide is usually a senior scholar or somebody who's not just an emerging scholar. I think this metaphor, like you're talking about, and I love this, you have to learn how to design something. You don't just go in. It makes it so it can be like I'm using mood boarding and interior design stuff, and I'm learning all that for the first time. So there is this ability to jump in and learn these things on your own. But there's also the sense of you can learn from somebody else. Like it does get at the learning piece, and it makes it clear that I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about, I know you're thinking about, Royce, is that it leaves us more open to metaphors of symmetric socialization as opposed to asymmetric socialization. Because when you're designing a room, there's no one way to do it. There's different aesthetics. Like the apprentice might have some really amazing ideas the senior craftsman might never have thought of, right? And in art contexts, like, yeah, of course, there's the politics and the hierarchy, but much less so that in certain science contexts that I've been in, where it's like, I'm the senior scholar, I know how to theorize, like, that's not a way that we do things. So, anyway, that was kind of a mishmash of thoughts. Mostly, I just appreciate that thinking like this made you think about those other things, which to me at least feel productive. I'm not claiming that this is like resolving everything, nothing ever will. My main contention is I think this is productive to get us to think about all these other pieces, and I think it's productive for emerging scholars to give a way in to think about theorizing in ways that resonate with their aesthetics, their values from the get-go, as opposed to feeling like it's this outside thing. Like basically challenging the elitist view of aesthetics as museum art. Like you don't need to be a critic to talk about theorizing, in my mind. Like people live theory, whether they're researchers or not, in my view. And to be fair, some people disagree with that, especially folks that are doing more science-oriented things. So they might not agree on the extent of that. But even in science, aesthetics play a role in what happens. So I do think the extent to which people might lean into this in the ways might be differently. But I'm finding it valuable, and folks that I talk with are finding it valuable. I'm finding to just push in a different direction, I guess. Move outside of the math and science space and think like, what if this was in art? How would that change what we're doing?
So I am going to say that it's 3 15 where I am, so I am going to stop recording. Um and